How you doing? Yeah. Hello. Yeah, some people do go by the lips reading. It's good to see all of you here tonight. Those of you that are wandering in, some are still getting coffee outside, and I myself am not following my own advice and having proper margins. Burning the candle at both ends. But it's still good to see all of you guys. Thank you for coming. Looks like I scared a couple people away, but tonight I want to talk about kind of how we got where we got. Have you been praying? Did you all vote yet?
Yes, not yet. Yet to come.
Still time to vote. It's not like anything's happening in the Middle East or anything like that. We're not killing off anybody. You know, last week was a little fire hydrant. I really wanted to get up to the 20th century in the first week. That's a lot. That's a tall order. It took me 8 weeks to get there one time through this series. If you're interested in more detail on some of the things that we talk about, you can go on the old service. If you go on the sermons page on the website, there's a tab that says Wednesday night, and you can scroll down to an older series called The Crescent and the Cross. And it follows all the way up through all of these things in greater detail. So we're kind of just flying high. I wanted to talk about peace in the Middle East, and part of it is I asked last week. I kind of just took a barometer. Thank you so much, wonderful Miss Nadine. I appreciate it very much. She's teaching her own class. This is kind of hard because I usually have staff to help me with stuff, and they're all teaching classes. Would you help with that? So thank you very much. A lot of this is on the notes from last week because we didn't really finish up last week, right? So if you don't have it, you can pull up the ones from last week. And I want to kind of just continue on through the maps, but I have a scripture tonight for you. And I want to ask you if this still applies to modern 20th century relationships with other people that we deal with. And so the Bible says this in Psalm. What? Keep that. You know how to do it, Sarah? How to make it? Hey, it's because it wasn't on. User error. In all my inventions, I've never been able to cure two things: computer glitches and user error. These will be with you always, I think. Read it with me, would you? It says, Lord, who may dwell in your sacred tent? Who may live on your holy mountain? The one whose walk is blameless and who does what is righteous, who speaks the truth from their heart, whose tongue utters no slander, who does no wrong to a neighbor, who keeps an oath even when it hurts, and does not change their mind. Isn't that a great word? Now that's old. How many people live by that today? How many governments live by that? They keep their oaths even though it hurts. It's difficult. Can we apply that same morality to an individual? Like we shouldn't lie to our neighbor to get our way, or we shouldn't, promise them something that we have no way of fulfilling. Is that even realistic for governments? What do you think? See a lot of eye rolling and stuff like that. Is it exactly the same? Is it a little bit different? Sun Tzu says all warfare is all war is deception. Says you've got to deceive to get it done. That's just the very nature of it. So I don't know. I told you I have more questions than answers, but let me just walk down through some more maps, can we? Let's get up to the 20th century as quick as possible. Really where I want to get is World War I. And so when I asked last week, a lot of people say, well, it's the Canaanites. Back in the ancient world, the Canaanites, but you know what? I brought my spectacles. You guys can see, but I'm getting old. And look at that, how beautiful it is when I have glasses on. But you remember the Canaanites lived in this area? And now, by this time, it's 641 BC, so Muhammad came along in 610. Within 30 years, the Muslims had conquered all of the Persian Empire, which was the Sassanid Empire, And all of the about 3/4 of the Byzantine Empire, who used to occupy the Holy Land and all of this, the Byzantine Empire was the eastern half of the Roman Empire. So the western half got conquered by all these people, the Visigoths and the Lombards and the Ostrogoths and all these people. They weren't quite Europe yet. They were still just a bunch of pagan tribes. They weren't even Christian yet. And so in the meantime, the Muslims had taken over a lot of the world. This was one of the most powerful forces on the face of the planet. And then Charlie asked last week, so where did the Shia come from? And so there was a controversy from the very beginning, like happens with a lot of wills. I don't know if you've ever had a contested wills between your brothers and your sisters or whatever, but when Muhammad died, there were a couple of different stories. And who knows, one of them might be true, the other false, or they both might be true. But that he promised it to one person, the succession, and he promised to his cousin Ali. And so the part of the whole family that were on the side of Ali is called the sect of Ali, or the Shia. So that's what Shia means. It basically comes down to a political disagreement on who was the rightful heir. Now, because of history and geography and stuff like that, you can find a lot of different historical differences too. It becomes almost like the Protestants and the Catholics. But in modern day, about 85 to 90% of the Muslim world, depending on who's counting, is Sunni. They would be the Catholic, I guess. They're the foundation. They're the main branch of Islam, and about 10 to 15% is Shia. And one of the differences is too, this is a generality because there's exceptions to it, but when you think of Shia, you think of the Ayatollah in Iran. So since the 70s at least, we tend to think of them as the more radical, the more militant, but that is not always true. Because ISIS, for example, was Sunni. And so it goes back and forth. There are moderate Shias and Sunnis and radical Shias and Sunnis. So anyway, but that was the sect of Ali, and there were a couple others that branched off. I'm going to try to go fast and not get down in the weeds. So would you do this? Just shoot up your hand. If you have a question, would you explain that word, Pastor Mike, or what was that again? Do you have any questions so far? All right.
So that green area, that whole green area, that was Muslims took all that?
I chose to make the Muslims green. No apparent reasons. I just used color codes. Yeah, so check this out. By the Umayyad, this is the next caliphate. By the way, the emperor of a Muslim empire is called the caliph. And so their empire is called a caliphate. If it's Persian, they're called sultans, and you call their empire a sultanate. Right? So those are just the words in those cultures that they use. So like ISIS was, their stated goal was to bring back a global worldwide caliphate again. They're trying basically, it has never been greater than the Umayyad caliphate. This is the greatest extent, although that's not entirely true. I should back up that statement. In this area, it's never been so unified. But now we have Muslim countries in southern Africa and in Asia and all over the world. So I shouldn't say the greatest extent, but this was really one of the heydays. And notice, it goes all the way up into, this is Spain. So this is the Iberian Peninsula. The Umayyad Caliphate went all the way up into Europe. Yeah.
Was this all under one leader, and was it all taken by force?
Was it all under one leader and all taken by force? Does somebody want to use this, or I can just repeat the questions too? Is there anybody that wants to man the microphone? Thanks, Reggie. All right, so I'll answer that one. You don't have to get that one. But was it all under one leader? It depends. So you'll notice back in Ali, they were split up. And if you can imagine, even in times that the map looks like this, that there were people in different areas vying for power. And so I don't know if you could ever say it's all entirely, but at least to some extent on paper, it was a unified caliphate. All right, I'll just leave it at that. Is the United States under one leader? Hardly. Technically, right, but not really, right? So there was a lot of divisions and things. He moved the capital to Damascus, and under the Umayyad Caliphate, there was several caliphs under that banner. These are kind of dynasties. And these are the ones that built the Dome on the Rock. So, which is it's still standing, the giant golden dome. It was built to be the exact dimensions, the dome itself, to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which was built by the Byzantines, so to honor the death of Christ. And it was over the rock that we talked about last week, where the story is, where Abraham went up to sacrifice Isaac. And so that story, the binding of Isaac, is very important, especially for Judaism. In Christianity, because it's symbolic of Jesus' death, but it's a very important story in Islam too. Only in theirs, it's not Isaac that is sacrificed, but it's Ishmael. And their version of the story is when the Lord told him to sacrifice Ishmael, because they see their descendancy from him. The sacrifice Ishmael didn't complain. In fact, Ishmael volunteered. He said, I would love to be submitted and do the will of the Lord. And because of that, God supplied a ram. Not too much different of the story, right? But the word Islam means many things, but the basic idea of it is submission. So it's submission to the Lord, obedience to the Lord, which are very biblical concepts. It's important to realize Islam wasn't formed like to be a satanic cult. Islam was formed to be an Arab version of the Judeo-Christian religion, of the Abrahamic religion. And so they honored Abraham, and they honored Moses, and they honored Jesus, but not as the Son of God, but as prophets that came before Muhammad. And so anyway, so this was a very important time. And then the Fatimids took over. So this is one of the first it was out of Egypt, and it was a Shia caliphate. So this is one of the first full-fledged Shia caliphates. And so the Abbasids took over the rest of the Arab territories. The Tahirids took over the Persian area, Idrisids. So you asked if they were unified. Well, not for long, right? Eventually it turns out into something else. And the Fatimids were the ones that really made Europe angry, because they were more hostile, and they would cut off pilgrimages, and they would take over and not let people come down and visit the holy sites, and so on and so forth. And you notice up in Europe too, there was a new king that unified all of those pagan tribes. His name was Charles the Great, and he was really the beginning of the creation of Europe. And so he was appointed and anointed sometime around this time, and they weren't quite yet the Holy Roman Empire, but that's what was going to come of them. And in fact, a lot of the kings and queens of many different European countries traced their lineage from Charles the Great. So anyway, anything else on that? All right. And then something happened. So watch the map again, especially the right side of it. So you've got the Fatimids, right? The Shias, and they took over the three holiest sites in Islam. So you've got Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem. So these three are the three holy sites for Muslims. And this really angered people up here, especially the Turks who are from up here. And now the Turks is another ethnic group. And so far we have that's taken over. First it was the Israelites took it over from the Canaanites. What happened to the Canaanites? They got absorbed. By the time of David and Solomon's kingdom, there were no Canaanites anymore. The Canaanites were the people of the land who eventually became Israelites and Judeans. And so ethnically, they were proto-Israelites. And then the Philistines, remember those guys, landed on the coast. Many people think they came from Greece, but they landed. The Egyptians hated them. Obviously, the Israelites hated them. They had big guys that would come and boast, and Samson hated them. They were the enemies of that. But by the time the Assyrians had come down, conquered the northern kingdom, all of those Philistine city-states got absorbed too. They got wiped out, burnt to the ground. We have the archaeology of it. At some point, all of those Philistine city-states just got wiped out. And those people got exiled just like the Israelites did. And where are they today? There's nobody today that I think rightly could claim, I am the ethnic descendant of an Israelite or a Philistine. Although they've tried, because they, every once in a while, find bones, and they try to match DNA up and stuff like that. But so the ancient Philistines really don't have any ethnic connection with what's going on today. All right. So the Muslim Turks, who were Sunni, absolutely hated the fact that these Shias had taken over their 3 holy sites. And so arose a sultanate called the Seljuk Turks. And they came down basically with the stated goal to get the Fatimids out of the holy site, to take this back over. But on their way over, they noticed, because you kind of have to go like this around the desert, they noticed how much great grazing land there was over here in this landmass is called Anatolia. Today it's called Turkey. And it's called that because of what just happened. And so you notice also this orange part, this right here is the capital of the Byzantine Empire, and they got really close to it. They at one point even captured the emperor of the Byzantine Empire. And so all of a sudden, the Byzantines remembered that they used to be cousins with the Catholics over in Europe, and they formed an allegiance, and they started having these big meetings and talk about all the horrible things. It was like, I was going to tie it into modern day, and I'm not going to because it would be partisan. But it would be like somebody standing up and overselling how bad they treat the pilgrims when they go down to Israel, just to get everybody riled up. And then they promised them money and fame and fortune, and they would go to heaven if they went down and fought in the name of the cross and got these dirty, rotten Muslims out of the Holy Land and rescued it. So for all of those reasons, the Crusades, and once again, in the Crescent and the Cross, I go through all of the Crusades. Because every one of them was different, led by a different king, motivated by different things. But some of it was political, some of it was for fame and glory, some of it was religious. And so if you tell your kids, their teachers will tell them, this is just Christians trying to impose their will on peace-loving Muslims. It was not that simple. And so Teddy Roosevelt, who's a great student of history, his opinion is that if Europe had not united and armed, then the whole world today would be Muslim. Because that's how close it came. They were really responding to a very real threat. And this wasn't even their target, this was. And within a few short years, by the time the Crusades actually happened, 100 years later, things had changed. And so, listen, so the Europeans decide to go down there and recapture the Holy Land. Only the Muslims that are there now aren't the Muslims that were making them mad. The Fatimids were no longer in charge. The Seljuk Turks were. So when we got down there, we were fighting against Seljuks. And when I say we, I only say that because I have an ancestor that fought in those. But I don't think that they did the right thing. And by this time, the Holy Roman Empire was fully established and fighting with the Lombards. Molly's family grew up right here. And next slide. And so the Crusaders came down beginning in about 1099. And by the time they were done, they had created the county of Edessa. They'd created the Principality of Antioch, the county of Tripoli, and the Kingdom of Jerusalem. And so that's kind of that stage of the Crusader reign in little strips of land. And these are not people that were from there. These are people that took it over by force and had to keep it by force. Their supply lines are clear from Europe. You know, by the time they would get down to a crusade, like 80% of them were gone or dead. And then there was one crusade after another trying to hang on to this land. And then arose one of my guys. Now I say this, it's going to sound like I'm in favor of this, but I'm just as a student of history. I don't know if I was to meet him, he'd probably be a bad guy. But you know, like a lot of people, you might hate the Nazis. Any World War II buffs in here? You might hate the Nazis, but have a little secret appreciation for Erwin Rommel, who was the Desert Fox, this great German, you know. So you can have an appreciation for somebody that's on the enemy side, even though you're not for them. But out of Egypt arose a new leader, and he was not Arab and he was not Turkish, he was Kurdish. If you don't know what those things are, you just got to look it up. It's another people group. And all of the modern day Kurds in Iraq and in Syria and in Turkey and in those different areas that don't have their own homeland, they are descended from this generation. And the guy's name was Salah ad-Din Ayyubi, otherwise known in Europe as Saladin. And the Peshmerga, which is a Kurdish militia. So how did we beat ISIS? Under Donald Trump, actually it began under Ash Carter, under Obama, that he sent Ash Carter in there and organized all of the Kurds in northern Syria. And we supplied them with weapons and ammunition and changed out their AK-47s for modern rifles. But it was those Kurds that fought. And those Kurds are descendants from Saladin. And so he's still very well known. Even on the Peshmerga, they have there's a badge on their sleeve that pays tribute to Saladin. And Saladin came up and was a great warrior and eventually ended up taking back the city of Jerusalem and eventually surrounding and then making peace with the Europeans there. So this is a whole generation later. And here's my favorite picture of him. Is that an awesome picture? This is from the Middle Ages, like from the 1200s or something like that. Some Spanish artist, but I just love that. I think that guy used to play cornerback for the Seahawks, if I'm not mistaken. Or at least every time I see those dreadlocks, I think of this picture of Saladin. No? Anyway, I really dig this kind of stuff. I go, wow, that's awesome. But that was their picture. At one point, I forget which crusade, the 8th or 9th, you know, how many different times they tried to get him. They had all across Europe a Saladin tax because they were trying to get rid of him. And when Richard the Lionheart, Richard of England, finally went down, he did great battles. And once again, it's been a couple years, the 8th or the 9th crusade, and he and Saladin went at it. Went back and forth, and they would capture each other's prisoners and behead 300 of them, both sides. And then they would chase them up the beach and take over the city. And all. They had great wars. They sent letters back and forth between each other. And so far as I can tell, they never met, but it would be a great movie if they had met. Because by the time they were done, they went home and signed a peace treaty and negotiated a peaceful settlement for Jerusalem. And they had an appreciation for each other when they were all done. And so I have a movie clip that I've shown before, but if you haven't seen the movie, The Kingdom of Heaven, it's about the Crusaders fighting against what they called the Saracens, which were the Muslims that were in Jerusalem. Is the volume up? I don't know. You did it? And Sarah's back there doing everything. Matt, you want it? It's okay, don't you? Jeff knows how to do it. Oh. It's on.
I wonder if it would not be better if you did. You will destroy your army here and never raise another. I swear to God that to take this city will be the end of you. Every stone and every Christian knight you kill will take 10 Saracens with him. You will destroy your army here and never raise another. I swear to God that to take this city will be the end of you. Yours. Will you yield the city? Before I lose it, I will burn it to the ground. Your holy places, ours, every last thing in Jerusalem that drives men mad. I wonder if it would not
not be better if you did. You will destroy. Will you yield the city?
Before I lose it, I will burn it to the ground. Your holy places, ours, every last thing in Jerusalem that drives men mad.
I wonder if it would not be better if you did. You will destroy it.
Every stone and every Christian knight you kill will take 10.
Will you yield the city?
Before I lose it, I will burn it to the ground. Your holy places, ours, every last thing in Jerusalem that drives men mad.
I wonder if it would not be better if you did. You will destroy it.
Every stone and every Christian knight you kill will take 10 Saracens with him. You will destroy your army here and never raise another. I swear to God that to take this city will be the end of you.
Your city is full of women and children. If my army will die, so will your city.
You offer terms, I ask none.
I will give every soul safe conduct to Christian lands. Every soul. The women, the children, the old, and all your knights and soldiers, and your queen. Your king, such as he is, I leave to you, and what God will make of him. No one will be harmed. I swear to God.
The Christians butchered every Muslim within the walls when they took this city.
I am not those men. I am Salahuddin. Salahuddin.
Then under these terms, I surrender Jerusalem.
Assalamu alaikum.
And peace be with you. What is Jerusalem worth?
Nothing. Everything.
What does he mean by that? What is Jerusalem worth? Nothing. Everything. Everything. And I don't know if you noticed the rubble around and the dead bodies, but that didn't happen to Jerusalem once. That has happened to Jerusalem dozens and dozens of times. 37 different kingdoms. So everybody, the Egyptians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians tore it to the ground. The Romans tore it to the ground. And even after that, every kingdom that conquered it, the Crusaders destroyed it. The Muslims, the Mamluks after them, cut every tree down in Israel, burned all the buildings. To me, when we go to Israel and find anything standing, anything left from the ancient world, it's a miracle. Because if you are at war, at lifelong war with somebody, when you take over their prized possession, you don't want to leave anything left of it. And so when people argue about it and they talk about whether or not we should take it back over and tear down the Dome of the Rock and turn it into a Christian church or something like that, I said, the Christians, the Crusaders had it for 100 years and they didn't do anything with the Temple Mount. They left it there. And so once again, to me, it's not that plot of land that's so significant. It's how are we going to find peace in this area? So, during the Crusades, because we have a lot of literature from both Europe and Muslim sources, the Muslims were very literate. And so we have a lot of literature from that time, and they really considered the Europeans to be the barbarians. They would accuse the Europeans of cannibalism and being barbarians and all this stuff, and who knows, whatever is true. But so we come down towards the time when the Ayyubids had taken over. Another empire takes over in this area. I have to put my glasses back on. And then something strange happens. A new people group that haven't even entered in. They're called Mongols. You ever heard of the Mongols? This is Genghis Khan and his sons, one of whom was this guy, the Ilkhan. And when he came in, he took over this whole area. So what I don't have is the White Horde and the Golden Horde and those areas that took over all of Europe, all of Asia. So during this time, the part of the Asians that came down here was under the Mongol Ilkhanate. And believe it or not, guess what religion he was? Well, he was a Buddhist and his wife was a Nestorian Christian. Isn't it strange? The whole thing has kind of come full circle. So now you have, whose side are we supposed to be on this crazy map now? We have so many different people in play. We have Asian Christians, and now we have Kurdish Sunni Muslims, and we have Turkish Shia, and then we have these guys over here. Oh, and then, by the way, during the Fourth Crusade, a bunch of people from Sicily, they were called the Lombards, and they were Christians, they got offered some prize money from the Byzantine emperor to come back and help put him back in charge because there was a coup in Constantinople. And when they got there, he had died and his son was in charge. And they said, yeah, but what about our money? And they said, well, we didn't make a deal with you guys. And so to get revenge and to get their money back, the Lombard Crusaders sacked Constantinople, Christian on Christian. They sacked the last remaining capital of the Christian empire, thus ending the Byzantine or Eastern Orthodox Empire. One of the saddest things in the world. Some of the Crusades were Christians against Christians. And so the story keeps going. And then comes along another one of my favorites. So he asked me, the two people that fascinated me are Saladin, because not many people talk about it, and the other one is the Mamluks. You ever heard of the Mamluks before? So a Mamluk, I was in a museum in Jerusalem walking around this kind of, basically it's a version of this where you walk around in the courtyard in what we think is probably Herod's courtyard, and all down through the history, and I turned around and there's this samurai warrior on a horse. I'm like, what the heck is that? Okay, first of all, I just passed the suit of armor with like some knight of the round table. And now, who are these people? And it's the Mamluks. So for all of those years, during all of those caliphates, the Muslim caliphs had been collecting a warrior class of slaves called Mamluks. And they got them from all over the world, from the Vikings down through the north. And it was kind of like a whole warrior subsection. They were the warriors of the Muslim caliphs. And it's really weird. The closest thing I could describe them, they dressed like samurais and they acted like Klingons. They were smart, but they kind of kept to themselves. They were nominally Muslim, but not really that Muslim. And they were slaves, but they had high offices, and They had their own culture. And at one point, the last sultan of the sultanate died, and the Mamluk leader married his wife and called himself so he was the first Mamluk sultan. It was like, when they say that the inmates have taken over the prison, when the Mamluks took over the Muslim world, one of my favorite little slices of history. And they were not nice. They were mean. They were harsher even on the Holy Land. And so they were the ones that got rid of the last vestiges of Crusaders and Europeans. Just got rid of them. They were Sunni Muslim, and their ethnicity was Kipchak Turkish. So kind of like from up at the Caucasus Mountains of southern Russia, up in that area. Once again, when people say, well, whose land is this anyway? At one point, it was Mamluks. No? Okay, anyway. Look up the Mamluks sometime. And then the Timurid Empire, and I won't get into him, another ferocious empire. And somewhere in this time, there was a dynasty called the Ottomans, the people that invented the footstool in front of your chair at your house. And the Ottoman Empire, it started small. It was in Turkey, modern-day Turkey, and then in southern Eastern Europe. So you know how a lot of Eastern Europeans are Muslim? It's because of the Ottoman Empire. And by about 1880, the Ottoman Empire had taken over a lot of southern Europe, all of the Middle East, and all of northern Africa. And the Ottoman Empire, notice the date just skipped all the way to 1880. The Ottoman Empire brought the whole world into the modern era. So this is just before the 20th century. So they got to see railroads and telegraphs and things like that, and modern warfare. For about 500 years, they had a series of about 12 wars with the Russians. So the Russians were Christian, and the Russians, since Rome had fallen and Istanbul was sacked by the Crusaders, the last remaining capital of the Christian world was Moscow. So this is one of those straight, did you know in the 19th century, the last defender of Christianity was Moscow in Russia. The Russians were holding the bag. And so when the Ottomans would attack Christians in this area, it was the Russians that came to the rescue. So these wars went back and forth. The last and most horrible one is called the Crimean War. Vladimir Putin just took over the Crimean Peninsula right here. And now this is all, by the way, this is modern Ukraine. You know how Vladimir Putin says, well, it used to be a part of Russia. He's not wrong. But it split up after the fall of the Soviet Union. But across the Black Sea, the Ottomans and the Russians fought painfully. The Crimean War is where we get the charge of the Light Brigade, and we get Florence Nightingale. And they had explosive shells, they had cameras, and timely details. So this is one of the first wars that we ever had photographs of. And it was horrible. It was horrible. And so at the end of that, with the whole world, Matt, arose the Austria-Hungary and Germany, and they were all mad at each other, and you can look up the causes of World War I. Then Archduke Ferdinand is assassinated, and the world split up in the war that ends all wars, which is otherwise known as World War I. They didn't call it World War I because they didn't think there was going to be another one. But eventually, that's what we called it. And so it was Austria-Hungary and Germany against Russia, and Russia was on the side of Great Britain and France and Italy. And so the world kind of split up, and the Ottomans, because they hated the Russians, made the biggest mistake of all, and they sided with the Germans and Austria-Hungary. And because of that, it ended up putting Great Britain and France in charge of it. Even before that, there was a sect down here in Egypt by a guy named Muhammad Ali, the original one. And he wanted control of Egypt. And so in a series of wars, Great Britain came down and fought against the Ottomans and installed Muhammad Ali. So already Britain was beginning to show their prowess. But here's what World War I looked like. And so France, it took over basically Western Western Africa, and they still have a presence there, like in places like Morocco and North Africa and stuff like that. Italy came down into Northern Africa, which is modern-day Libya. Great Britain took over Egypt and Sudan, and then there's the Ottoman Empire, who still occupied the north part of the Holy Land. It was between them and the British. So in World War I, in this area, it was the British versus the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, who were another modern army. This is not like the terrorists that we've today. The Ottoman Empire was very modern. They're the ones, by the way, when we go to Jerusalem, when they show the old city and those walls around it, the modern walls around Jerusalem were built by the Ottomans. And so World War I was the Ottoman Turks versus the British in that area. And in order to win the war, you notice all these people down here, this is what's left of those great caliphates, were a bunch of disjointed Arab tribes that didn't like each other, that just looked after themselves and didn't want to get involved. And there were a few key leaders that came down to convince the Arabs to get involved in World War I and help out to defeat the Ottoman Turks. And one of them's name was T.E. Lawrence, otherwise known as Lawrence of Arabia. So I don't know if you've ever seen that movie. Clip coming, by the way. It's why I worked to get the video. Why I'm late tonight is because I was finishing up the Lawrence of Arabia video. And I don't think the video clip is next. Oh, I could be wrong. It could be next. And so this scene, all right, the Sharif, or the king of Hejaz, is a guy named, oh man, I have to look at my notes, is Grand Sharif Hussein bin Ali of Mecca. And so he was the main guy. He's the godfather of many of the modern Arab countries. And so his sons are going to end up being the first ones in charge of Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. So in the movie, remember Alec Guinness, who is Obi-Wan Kenobi? He is Prince Faisal, who is Ali's son. And so Faisal is fighting, and the British are helping him to fight against the Ottoman Empire. And the promise is that if Prince Faisal helps them, that he's going to be King Faisal after the war. And so at one point, he's really trying to argue hard to General Allenby, who wants him to come back and help out with the Suez Canal, and he wants to go forward to Aqaba. And he said, but I need cannons, because he knows that'll give him a big standing afterwards. And T.E. Lawrence, after the general convinces him to go back and do what he did, after they left, Lawrence of Arabia convinces him to ignore the British and go down anyway. And so this is Lawrence of Arabia meeting with another guy, and you'll hear his name, but it's another one of these tribal leaders, and he's trying to convince him to join in with Faisal and to go and to fight against the Turks. And this is the scene. The only reason I saw the scene, by the way, it's one of the greatest scenes in all of cinema history. One of my favorite, three of the greatest actors, Omar Sharif and I always just freeze on names. Anyway, the other two guys. But it's a great scene, but it just kind of shows you a little bit of the interplay between the British and the various tribal factions. All right, watch this. Who is it? Anthony Quinn and Peter O'Toole.
This thing you work against Aqaba, what profit do you hope from it?
We work it for Faisal of Mecca. The Harith do not work for profit.
Well, if it isn't a man to be a servant, Sharif Ali, he could find worse masters than Faisal. But I cannot serve.
You permit the Turks to stay in Aqaba?
Yes, it is my pleasure.
We do not work this thing for Faisal.
No. For the English, then?
for the Arabs.
The Arabs. The Hawitat, Ajili, Rala, Beni Sakhr, these I know. I have even heard of the Harith. But the Arabs? What tribe is that?
They're a tribe of slaves. They serve the Turks.
Well, they are nothing to me. My tribe is the Hawitat,
Work only for profit.
who work at Audo's pleasure.
And Auda's pleasure is to serve the Turks.
Serve. I serve?
It is the servant who takes money.
I am Auda Abutai. Does Auda serve? Does Auda Abutai serve? I carry 23 great wounds, all got in battle. 75 men have I killed with my own hands in battle. I scatter, I burn my enemies' tents. I take away their flocks and herds. The Turks pay me a golden treasure, yet I am poor, because I am a river to my people. Is that service?
And yet now it seems Auda has grown old and lost his taste for fighting.
It is well you say it in my tent, thou tulip.
Yet this is a tulip that the Turks could not buy.
Why should they wish to? Now, I will tell you what they pay me, and you will tell me if this is a servant's wages. They pay me, month by month, 100 golden guineas.
150, Auda.
Who told thee that?
I have long ears.
And a long tongue between them.
100, 150, what matters? It's a trifle. A trifle, which they take from a great box they have.
In Aqaba.
In Aqaba.
Where else?
You trouble me like women.
Friends, we have been foolish. Auda will not come to Aqaba.
No.
For money.
No.
For Faisal.
No.
Nor to drive away the Turks. He will come because it is his pleasure.
Thy mother mated with a scorpion.
What do you see in that scene? Anything? Surprise you? What does it make you think of? What is it? Any comments, thoughts? How fractured they all are, and still are. And so one thing you can never get rid of, remember I said a couple minutes ago, I can't get rid of computer glitches or human error? And one of the things that was very important, even at the very beginning of Islam, is it united the Arab tribes. And why it's still important in those areas, because it unites them. But no matter how hard they try, they still cannot get over those factions, those power grabs. And so some of that will always be there. But there was a little bit of a hint of something as well that I think, two reasons that I have hope. One is I trust in the Lord, but whenever I see something kind of improve in the Middle East, I notice that there's something involved called money. And so in the end, you can be offended over what somebody did to your grandfather, but you still have to put food on the table. And so two things, and this is a spoiler alert, maybe I'm telling you the punchline before we get to the end of the week, but I never know who's going to come back. But two things give me hope, and just watching human nature, two things that give me hope that there are going to be pockets of peace in the Middle East, and we may never have where there's complete absence of war. But two of the great motivators that have made a change in the last even 50 years, one of them is time and the other one is money. Eventually, every nation that's eventually recognized Israel has done some because it's just good for business. And so I just pray, Lord, turn up Turn up the heat on the finances if that's what it takes for peace, right? So, all right, let's just go down through. So at the end of it, by the way, Russia, World War I was so horrific and so many people died. That's what ended Russia's Christianity, so to speak. Even though they didn't ever stop being Christian, but they became the first atheist nation in the world. And it was because of the horrors of defending Christianity during World War I. Now, I say that, but I saw a speech just a little while ago when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine. He got up in front of a crowd in a full soccer stadium and quoted from Scripture. Quoted that verse from Jesus. No one has greater love for his friend than this, that he laid down his life for his friend. I said, what? Vladimir Putin is quoting from the Bible, right? So there still is an ancient root of Christianity, Russian Orthodox Christianity, that's in that country. That gives me hope. Anybody else? That gives me hope, as long as that seed is still there. And then afterwards, there's several documents that I wanted to show. The League of Nations, which was the predecessor to the United Nations, carved up the Middle East according to a mandate. And so here are a couple things. This is to a letter to the Sharif of Mecca. Remember in that scene, he just mentioned him. So this is the father. This is the father that it was going to be split up between his sons, and where he basically says, I've talked to all the leaders in Britain, and we've agreed after this war that the Arabs need to have their own, that they need to be set free and have their own state. So what that means, it's not specifically talking about Palestine, but he's talking about a guarantee. So this is called the McMahon, it's called the Hussein-McMahon Correspondence. Then in 1916, they drew up this map. These are three of, by the way, these are the three smoking gun documents from this whole controversy. And this is a map that was drawn up during the war, right around the same time that Lawrence of Arabia was promising the Arabs that they'd have their own free state. And this is the map that with colored pencil, France and Britain were carving up the Middle East, and all the A section is going to be French, and all of the B section is going to be the British. And after World War I ended, the League of Nations gave British and France the mandates over the Middle East. So I don't know if you know this from reading any history, but nobody likes to be occupied. And so in their exchange for helping and fighting alongside of Britain and France to get rid of the Ottoman Turks, Britain and France carved up the Middle East and says, no, we're in charge of it. And they attempted to go on from that perspective, very colonial. And you could argue whether this is good or bad, but they carved it up. So and then the last thing was this. And at the same time, another correspondence took place that in 1916 that set up a plan that agreed that because of the Jews that were being expelled from Europe, that the Holy Land needed to be given, the Palestine needed to be given to the Jewish people. So the British were promising one thing to one side and one thing to the other. Let's just blame everything on the British, can we? We're not the British. I keep saying us, but that wasn't us. America wasn't in it. This is the map that T.E. Lawrence drew and presented. And so notice he has all this area, Arabs, and there's Palestine down here. And he called this area Phoenicia. And this is what it looked like at the end. And I'm going to end with this map. And by the time they got done, this is what mandatory Palestine looked like in 1935. And it's amazing to me is a lot of the Middle East still looks like this. This is with a few minor changes. This is basically how the modern Middle East came to be. And you notice, and none of this was chosen by Arab people. It's just chosen by the French and the English, right? And so you wonder, where are all the seeds of animosity? Well, wouldn't that be one? And so in this area, you have, this is Egypt, of course. The area to the west of the Jordan River was called Transjordan. It's all of this area, which is pretty much Jordan today. But it included a lot of what is over here in Palestine today. This area over here was called Palestine. For the moment, it just remained under British control. There were a lot of Arabs and increasing number of Jews in that area, and just for the time being, it's a British, basically a British Commonwealth area. It's not a colony. They called it the Mandate. So that's a big word, the mandatory Palestine. This area was called Mesopotamia. Eventually that'll be called Iraq. This area up here was given to the Ottomans, and now it's called Turkey. This whole area in here between these three countries of Syria, Iraq, and Ottoman, at one point on one of the maps about 1920, this was called Kurdistan. And I am a believer. So this is northern Syria, northern Iraq, and southern Kurdistan. And there's a lot of controversy that still happens over that. And somehow or another, the Ottomans, before they signed the peace treaty, fought back and got that wiped off the map. But there still are many, many Kurds that live in that area and are longing for their homeland. The Turks call them terrorists. But this is why the Turks just recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, it actually invaded and took over the northern part of Syria during the civil war, because the Kurds are up there. And the Kurds are the one up here. The Kurds in this area are the ones that helped us to overthrow ISIS. You know, and once again, I'll give credit. It started with Barack Obama, and then it kind of ended under President Trump. But when Trump says we got rid of ISIS, well, the Kurds got rid of ISIS with our help. But I still wonder what's going to go on with the Kurds there. This area is Persia. It's going to become Iran. And you still have kind of disintegrated Saudi groups. This one is under the House of Saud, and this whole area is going to become Saudi Arabia. But that's the deal. That's Palestine. And so what happens, and I'm not going to go through it all. Well, I will quickly. 1921. The French gave Syria to Faisal, so Syria is all of this right here, and they didn't want him, and so they kicked him out. And then Sultan Atrash fought for the Syrian independence in 1925. France forms a Christian republic in Lebanon. So Lebanon is right here. That's where Hezbollah is right now. Did you know that the French started Lebanon to be the only Christian nation in the Middle East? People say there are no Christian nations. Well, there is. And I forget, I have a list, but just Wikipedia. One of the, either it's the president or the prime minister is required to be a Maronite Christian, and then like the Secretary of State, it needs to be a Sunni Muslim, and then another part of the cabinet is supposed to be Shia Muslim, and another part is supposed to be Catholic. And their constitution created by the French, this experiment, it hasn't really held. It's Syria, or Lebanon's now one of the strongholds of Hezbollah, which is stronger than the government. But that was the idea, is maybe if we just put one of each religion on the cabinet, that'll solve all their problems. And it hasn't worked yet. But then Syria became, in the British Mandate, Western Palestine was held under the British Mandate. Transjordan was given to Abdullah I, who was Faisal's brother. And then the Kingdom of Egypt is granted independence, and Faisal I, who they didn't like him in Syria, but he ended up taking over Iraq instead. And then Iran, the Reza Shah leads a revolution to become the Shah of Persia, and then he forms the Islamic Republic of Iran in 1935, which is Shia. And in 1932, King Abdul Saud defeats Hussein to form Saudi Arabia, which is this area right here. Questions? Is this a good place to stop? I like to end it and that's how they solved the Middle East. No problems after that. Everybody lived happily ever after. What? Yes?
What did the French and the British want with all this?
They just stepped in because they won World War I and took control of it all?
No particular benefit to them.
Oh yeah, to benefit to them. But oil hadn't been discovered yet. But eventually their mandates will run out in the 1940s. And so what did they want? The question was, what did France and Britain want with that area? They won World War I, and so they were just dividing it up as they had won, and they were in control. And that's the off the top of Mike's head answer, right? What did the British and the French, that's probably a whole thesis paper you could write on that. What was their motivation? At that point, they were just the two conquering world powers. And so I think to a great extent, they were just wanting to divide up the land. Anybody else? Jeffrey.
So going through all that process, with all those changes and all the invasions and what have you, it strikes me as how did a nation of Israel, how did the Jew, how did they survive that? I mean, it's just like there's so many changes and invasions and destruction.
Well, they didn't survive in Palestine. Where the majority of Jews are in this period of time is not in Palestine at all. That's occupied by Arabs. More and more during the 20th century, like up through the 30s and 40s, because of the persecution in Europe, because that started before World War II, Palestine is becoming increasingly Jewish under the British mandate. And so what you see after World War I, that's why I said, when you say, where did the problem start? Where I start the modern conflicts in the Middle East, I start at World War I. Or even in that tent when the British are promising the land to people, right? That's the start of most of the problems. Most of them don't predate that. They'll make reference to the Crusades, but that's just symbolic. The modern problems that started with World War I and the French and the British mandates. And what did you ask? You had a great question. It was, what?
How did Israel survive?
How did they survive? Israel survived throughout the world. In this period of time, what we call Israel dispersed, we call it the diaspora. And so the nation of Israel didn't survive. The nation of Israel does not exist. The Jewish people, by culture and religion and ethnicity, are living all over the world. They're living in Germany, and they're living in Russia, and they're living in Poland, and they're living in all of those places where Hitler rooted them out of. And they're living in Spain, and they're living in Ethiopia. And so all over the world, that's why I said that the language of Hebrew all but disappeared, because they were speaking Yiddish. And so the Jews that lived up in Europe and Eastern Europe were called Ashkenazi Jews. And the Jews that lived in Spain were called Sephardic Jews. And there were Jews that were living down in Yemen, down in the southern Arabian Peninsula. And so how they survived, Jeff, was scattered all over the world. But they had no homeland. Palestine was not their homeland. Palestine was their place that some of them could visit, but very few of them lived there. Does that make sense? And so then the question was, and after World War II, the idea became, until they find a homeland, they're never going to be completely safe. And so one of the big plans that was pitched was even in South America. Maybe they could start over again in South America. But I'm going to leave it there with the Jews scattered all over the world. And I want to just stop and pray. So take a minute, would you? Find 3 or 4 friends and say, how do we pray about this tonight? You know, where did it start? Any discussion questions? I should come with better discussion questions. Kevin, did you have a question? Oh. So find 2 or 3 prayer partners tonight. Can we pray? Just pray for peace in this area. And I'm just going to end right here. Starting up next week, I'll kind of get into Zionism, Jeff, and the whole movement to repatriate, where the seeds of Zionism, which is the idea that the Jews that are scattered all over the world, they deserve their own homeland. So that begins next week. Buddy, let's... Oh, is that right? Next week is Harvest Party. We are not meeting on next week because there's Harvest Party. This will be all full of bouncy houses. So if you're spry, and you feel like coming into a bouncy house, you can come next week. But there will be no Wednesday night small groups next week, right? So it'll be the week after. We'll talk about Zionism. And what do you think? Do the Jewish people need their own homeland? That's my question. Should the Jewish people have their own homeland? All right, find 2 or 3 prayer partners tonight, would you? And just talk about that question and see what you think, okay? Should the Jewish people, do they deserve their own homeland?